This project was supported by Award 15PJDP 22GK00946MUMU, awarded by the Office of Juvenile Justice and the Office of Justice Programs. The opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this videocast are those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect those of the Department of Justice. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Reflections on Research, the podcast all about mentoring and mentoring research. I am Mike Geringer, the Senior Director of Research and Quality at Mentor, and your host for the podcast this year. I am joined today by an old friend and colleague, someone I've worked with for a very long time, and I'm very excited to have back on the podcast, and that is Dr. David DuBois. David, let me see if I can get all of your titles and professional designations correct here. You're a professor and also the Associate Dean for Research and the Associate Director of the Institute for Health Research and Policy at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Welcome, David. It's nice to have you with us.
Thanks, Mike. Great to be with you.
So this year I've kind of teased all of our guests about their school's mascot, but I already took care of UIC this year when Bernadette was on earlier this year. But we were both surprised that your mascot is the Flames, which I am guessing is a reference to the Great Chicago Fire. And we both felt like that was a pretty interesting choice for a mascot for a university in Chicago, because your city burned to the ground and a bunch of people died in the Great Chicago Fire. So we thought that was an odd choice of Flames, but it's a pretty good one. I bet you have a very colorful costume that shows up at the basketball games. So go Flames.
Yeah, yes. I think his or their name, I shouldn't assume gender, is Sparky, I think. Yeah, so yeah.
Sparky the Flame. I love it. Excellent. Well, hopefully good luck in the basketball season ahead. We are talking today, David. The reason I really wanted to have you on the podcast is something else related to our National Mentoring Resource Center project, and that is a new research evidence review that you recently authored around the concept of credible messenger mentoring. And that is kind of the use of people with certain backgrounds or lived experiences in mentoring young people. And I think our funders at the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention are certainly interested in that from a juvenile justice point of view. There seems to be, well, we'll talk about the evidence around using mentors, I should say, that have had some engagement with that system as mentors to young people. So I really wanted to have you on and just kind of unpack a little bit what you found in that review and kind of share a little bit with our audience about that term, because I think we all intuitively think, you know, all mentors should have some credibility to them. That's part of the role, I think, at some level. Right. But this is a specific term around a specific kind of work. And so I think let's just start with that, maybe just some simple definitional things. Obviously, in the case of JJ Youth, there's perhaps maybe your mentor has some involvement in that system when they were a young person themselves and are now trying to keep the next generation from going down that path. But I think as you started to work on this review, you and I talked a little bit about like, well, wait, there's a lot that goes into this concept of credibility and kind of lived life experience that I can bring to a mentoring relationship. And so I guess for the purposes of your review, how did you define that term and how wide of a net did you cast?
Yeah, no, it's great, a great setup for our discussion here. And so we focused in on entire programs that we're trying to take this model, and that's perhaps something we can touch on later in our conversation, because I think there's some opportunities for programs to utilize this concept, if you will, without necessarily making it their whole program model. But when it is the program's model, the idea then involves recruiting and engaging, supporting mentors who have life experience that is similar to that, as you were nicely outlining, that of the youth, young adults as well, we looked at, served by the program, that is similar in some area that is relevant to the program goal. That might sound very academic, but it is really I think just relevant to keep that in mind. So you mentioned the legal or justice system space, and so if somebody has themselves had that experience and you're looking to prevent recidivism from youth who have had some initial contact, might be on probation. You see that in some of the programs, or really taking a wider angle lens. It might be adults who have grown up in a similar neighborhood, which for a variety of contextual reasons is an environment in which it's more likely, or there's more susceptibility to becoming involved in the legal system, or other kinds of justice related kinds of things coming up. And so it isn't necessarily, and often really in practice, it's an intent of the program. Almost universally, I'll see our goal was to recruit mentors who ideally had, let's say, some experience themselves in the justice system, or were from the youth's own neighborhood. But as you also allude to, outside of the justice space, and or at least even some of it might overlap there, but you've got substance use, for example, right? And so individuals who, we were just talking before we hit record about a colleague of mine who does work with people who inject drugs, and often are young persons, young adults, and also, as they have done this work a number of years, seen thankfully those who make it to the other side of getting free and clear of that kind of devastating type of circumstance around substance abuse. And are they then positioned to serve as mentors? And the answer is a lot of programs and services will look at them as possibilities. And then you get, and I won't try to give you the full lay of the land, but just to flesh it out a little further, Michelle Munson, our fellow colleague, has done work with young adults who it would probably still say they have mental health challenges, but maybe are farther along in navigating those by age and experience, working as mentors with young persons who are receiving mental health services. And then you get into the kind of broader health space of chronic conditions like diabetes or arthritis, juvenile arthritis, variety of any spina bifida, the things that are fairly specific and very serious kind of conditions, and getting those young people paired up with those who are typically not all that much older than them in the big picture, but have that experience of navigating care and life circumstances related to their condition. So it's a fairly broad concept. What we don't mean are things along the lines of, at least for our kind of scholarly definitions, say gender or race, ethnicity, socioeconomic background writ large. Those can be, no doubt, impactful as areas of commonality, but this is it really involves something that's a little bit more specific around an experience or personal condition or status that one has.
Gotcha. No, I appreciate you mentioning that specificity, and I think it's important for our listeners to realize that I think there's even layers within that specificity, right? So I know in the disability space, practitioners are like, well, we'd like to give you a mentor that has a disability as well, so they can understand the impact that's having on your life and provide you kind of, guidance and paths forward. But I know there's some debate about like, well, does it have to be exactly the same disability? And what if I've got a milder version of it than you have of it? Does that, are we still on the same page in terms of how shared that lived experience is? And there's no right or wrong answer, I don't think, on those things. It's more just, to the degree which maybe it meets the young person's preferences for what they would find valuable, or what's easier to recruit, perhaps. Maybe there's practical considerations in that as well. But I appreciate you noting that we're not talking about just broad similarity here of, and as you said, those things might matter. It might really help a young woman to be paired with a adult female mentor to teach them some things about gender in America, for example. But here we're talking about kind of really specific experiences, backgrounds, and things that the average person maybe wouldn't bring that credibility to the table, right?
Right.
So I don't want to, kind of cut to the chase too much, because I know your review looks at this from a lot of thoughtful, different angles, but I know our listeners will probably just be wondering, as do most folks when they think about research, does this work? Is this a good idea? What evidence did you find in your review that these mentors not only can make a difference with young people, but did you see any hint that perhaps they might be better at it than a different kind of mentor would be? So I don't know if you have thoughts around the effectiveness of this work.
Yeah, it's as are many, if not almost all things in the research realm. It's complicated. However, I think it's fair to say, and I certainly came at this with, I think, a fairly objective vantage point. It's not a topic where I've been doing a lot of work myself. And obviously, I'm bullish on mentoring as a general resource for young people, but really try to there's a lot of passion around this topic. And I think that's wonderful to see, because passion will drive lots of good work, I think, both in practice and in the research realms. I tried to, again, take a little bit of a more dispassionate view about what's there, and I think it's safe to say it shows promise that there are findings that would suggest, I think, with a pretty good amount of empirical weight behind them, studies that youth who are supported, particularly I would say in the justice space, I'll say that's where the bigger studies have been done, is that they will end up less likely, for example, to have a future arrest if they were already had on probation. The Arches program is one we review, which has gotten a fair amount of attention based out of New York City. And I think you look at that and it's like, okay, seems like my kind of something's going on here, and it's probably good antenna as a researcher comes up. But then you look at it really closely and you're like, okay, well, first of all, it wasn't random assignment. So we hope that the youth who got engaged in this program were similar to the matched group, and they took a lot of care. But we always worry a little bit about selectivity, who steps up, who's tapped, and you try to measure. We don't know. Most of the studies have something like that will qualify them. And then the findings are typically not like, oh, across the board, the outcomes. Well, for felony arrest within the first 12 months, there was a statistically significant difference, and then it didn't reach significance in the latter 12. And in that particular study, interestingly, and this is a fairly sizable, I thought a pretty noteworthy variation. It was the younger youth, like 18 to 19-year-olds, not the 20-somes, who showed the evidence of benefiting. So if you're comparing arches, non-arches, when you're an 18, 19-year-old, those differences in future arrest were much more consistent and salient than they were for the kind of 20 upward. So we don't have enough research to know for sure. You can certainly spin a narrative that says, it's more of a teachable moment. They're less far into the life of what would maybe provide, keep attracting them or making it harder to get in a new pathway. So the other thing I want to mention is, along with the promise, it is somewhat also maybe not always so interesting to a non-academic group, but I want to mention it. Almost all of these programs, at least in the justice space, are multi-component. So they're bringing a lot of things to the table that are not mentoring, which may probably very arguably can be a good thing in terms of providing young people with the full spectrum of supports that they need if they've already been, for example, having some involvement in the system and maybe have gotten disengaged from formal education. They don't really have employment prospects. You can start to fill in, well, we could use a lot of different supports and helps there across those different areas, mental health issues coming up. So for example, there's another program called Choose to Change. I hope I got that name right, that they're researching here in Chicago, very large randomized controlled trial. So it's got that research design, but it's also got several components. They're also providing essentially psychotherapy, group psychotherapy from trained mental health professionals, along with the credible messenger mentors. And I should say in most of these kinds of programs, and this was true in Arches, the mentors are paid, which is somewhat different. And they're often, I think, full-time staff who are engaged in those roles and still with a very much a relational orientation to how they approach things. It's not just a bunch of transactions. Here's a referral to a GED program. So it is mentoring, but it is mentoring of a somewhat different stripe than some of us might be familiar with. The volunteer, have one mentor, one mentee, and so forth. And they're kind of more 24/7 available. I'm your go-to if something comes up. You can contact me. So that makes it hard, though, to say, as they are starting to have some favorable findings, is how much does it matter to have that credible messenger mentoring? Is it the psychotherapy and X, Y, or Z, other things, job placement, whatever else is going on, varies across programs. There's summer job programs. That's a big, nice, good thing to offer. But, to what extent is that the lever versus the mentoring? And I don't know how far the field will go down this path, but in the larger prevention field, this is very typical to start off with multi-component efforts and see if you can, make a positive difference with kind of a full court press of what seem to be key supports. And then they call it dismantling studies. You start to pull back and say, well, is it really necessary that they get the psychotherapy? So we have one group that isn't getting that, but they're getting the full-on case management, vice versa. And you can start to learn some things that are pretty interesting. But we're not at that stage. I did not come across any studies that were beginning to tease out, the mentoring piece as its degree to which it's responsible for some of the encouraging findings that are coming up.
Sure. Well, and it makes perfect sense that if these programs are drilling down on a specific youth need and really trying to address some things that maybe more traditional ways of mentoring have trouble addressing, that they would be designing programs that aren't just mentoring, but have tutoring and academic and housing support and job support and the mental health piece, all of that. It's an interesting question how much the mentoring adds on to the overall impact. Ultimately, the program is either helping people or it's not. I think, and just for listeners who I know sometimes people are like, promising, that doesn't sound very, no, I mean, you found plenty of evidence that these programs can be impactful. I think, tell me if I'm wrong here, but it's just, we don't have a lot to hang our hat on here research-wise. There has not been a ton of studies on this, and there certainly haven't been many that are like comparing, let's give you a credible messenger person versus a lay person versus no mentor versus, and so without, kind of that richness of studies to look at, you had to kind of call it as you saw it. And frankly, saying that something has got real promise is better than saying I didn't see any evidence it worked at all. So it's good news, I think, but we just need to learn more. Is that fair to say?
Very fair to say, and I don't use that word promise lightly. There has to be actual evidence. Sometimes people will use that term to mean conceptually it's promising. This is well beyond the conceptual promising stage.
Gotcha. Well, given that you looked kind of at all this research around whether it was working or not in the case of program to program, I'm also curious as to what you found about maybe ways that that was delivered, like what factors are influencing that. I mean, you already mentioned one, at least in the one program, it seemed to be a little more effective for younger participants than older ones for reasons that are a bit unknown, but I think your explanation was probably a good one there, that maybe younger kids are just more receptive to that help and less ingrained in negative things they need to overcome. What other factors seem to make a difference? Were there things related to how this was delivered, or just what other things kind of either made this work or maybe created a barrier to it working?
Yeah, that's good. It's a great question. Well, this is not going to be a news flash probably to anybody listening to this interview, but I will underscore it nonetheless. And this is true of mentoring programs writ large, and programs in general that are looking to help young people and any other group for that matter. If the program isn't delivered, if it doesn't reach them at some level of reasonable dosage, all bets are off. This is not some magic touch, and that, wow, I only saw that person a couple times, but man, when they talked, it was like this dates me, but like the E.F. Hutton, like E.F. Hutton talks, and all of a sudden everybody listens and their lives are changed, right? No, we have the same evidence in the Arches program. They did a really nice job. Is another example here of like, okay, it's somewhat arbitrary, but what do we think would be a minimum dose to say you kind of were, you really experienced this program? How many of the group sessions, because they had these group sessions that were a big part of the program, and they did journaling in those and got some social emotional skill supports, but how many of those did they actually make? And did they, how many of those kind of journaling entries and things did they engage in and actually go through that reflection process? Those kinds of things. That only as you might expect, when you see evidence that threshold is met, do you start to see the outcomes look positive. I mean, again, speaking in general terms, but that's significant. There are some other I call them very preliminary, but I think important findings to take note of, because partly, again, they align well with what we're seeing and have seen over the years in the mentoring research literature, which is deeper, than this literature, is really giving the relationships room to breathe and develop. I know in just my limited work with actually developing, implementing mentoring programs myself, we've run into this. It's like we overstuffed the curriculum. We had to pull it back. And it's like they were telling us, we had group gatherings too with women and teens, female teens, and it was like we want time to connect, and kind of catch up. And even though they did also still have the opportunity to see each other outside of the groups, but they were also forming connections across mentors, across mentees, and all the other combinations, mentor mentee who weren't matched together. So what you see in the qualitative research in particular, and by that I mean, we're really hearing from people in their own words, was this helpful, and if so, why? It really does speak to the kinds of experiences where the mentors had a chance to really share some of that life experience, right? Because in that same program that I was talking about, we interviewed the mentors at one point, and one of them, and it always stuck with me, she said, we said, what role do you feel like you're playing here? And said, I'm just the driver. And because they had to, pick the mentee up and get them there. So, oh God, that's not what we wanted, right? So that became our mantra. No, so it's like, how much our program's saying, hey, we've got you here, and we want you to share your experience, right? And it may not be in a nice, tidy package. It could even raise some issues, right, around what is considered to be appropriate, right? From some larger institutional organizational sponsorship around not just justice things, but it could be in the medical care realm or mental health realm, right? Yeah, this is kind of, I know this isn't the best way of coping, but sometimes I do X, and it's like, at least I'm not hurting myself. It's like, well, no, we don't, well, hey, you asked for lived experience. This is how I go about it, sometimes, whatever. And so I think you have to, not have to, but I think because we're seeing that there are really deep relationships and meaningful ties that are reported to have become deep and as meaningful as they are, in part because of that credible experience the person brings. And inspiration is also, I should say, a big piece of it. They can say nothing, just being present and seeing them lead their day-to-day lives, right? And again, that could involve some relapses into things. Yeah, I hung out with those guys again. It wasn't the smartest thing. We got into a little trouble, but I pulled back. I'm not doing that again. Whatever it is, they're out there as a role model for that person who's going to be making a similar journey. And so if you don't provide that room for that to happen, and things are very focused on meeting certain goals, like we got to get you and got to get you, get you to your GED, or have you gone to your job training program, being that case manager, as we noted, then you're really missing, I think, quite possibly, because we have evidence of this from the larger mentoring literature, that close, intimate connection is powerful. We see this with, again, mentoring in general, even when it's focused on things like academic outcomes. It's like, it's not just, in some ways almost better for that to be, letting it, develop into kind of almost a really substantially caring relationship. The Eisenhower Group, which does some work related to credible messengering with high school age youth, they have a big training program. It's called deep mentoring, right? It's like, no, we're going to really get in there and really, in this case, I don't know what they do, but if it's about credible and lived experience, that should be part of what is given room to grow. And I will say, just, and sorry to go on here too much, but I will say, repeatedly, and those working in this space, both practice and research, have concluded, not surprisingly, and this, again, similar to the larger mentoring literatures, training and ongoing supports are not to be underestimated in their importance. And in fact, if you also take the lens, as many are, that this is an empowerment model more generally for disenfranchised groups, including returning folks from the prison system who might be serving as mentors, as one example, or recovering from substance use issues, then this becomes something that they get more out of, because they're getting that kind of training, professional development and experience that they can point to. But they also, like anybody, they're not coming ready-made to be mentors. There was, if anything, it was almost more emphasis, but I'd just say, maybe because of the high need nature of the youth and the complexity of some of it, but it was by no means less. There was none of this kind of like, oh, well, they're kind of natural mentors, to use that phrase. They are, I'm sure, in some regards, but they just as likely are going to come with their own areas for growth. And if they're not given help with those, but what's the program trying to accomplish, and what are the kind of the ins and outs of how they're expecting mentors to conduct themselves, but really that ongoing piece. You can tell that I like to talk, so somebody helping me to talk less with my mentee and listen more, right? Even though I might have a wonderful lived experience connection, that's great. But I tell you about the time, it's like, yeah, you told me 3 times.
Yeah.
So it's like,
well, and I'm imagining it's pretty hard for a mentor who's lived through something to not project their own experience with that system or that time onto what the youth's going through now. I talk with our colleague Christian Rummel about this all the time, about out gay adults helping young people with their own coming out process. And, that looked and felt a little different maybe 30, 40 years ago for people, right? We hope that we've made a little progress on acceptance of these things since then, but, it's really hard to, have been through something, but allow the person you're helping to go through their own iteration of that experience. So yeah, I appreciate also the note you said about like, hey, if one of the goals here is to really keep it real by using people as mentors that have been in the thick of it, then you got to take some of the messiness of that along with the value of their lived experience. I think it was Michelle Munson, who you mentioned earlier, did a review of naturally found mentors for youth with mental health needs. And those mentors often have been through their own mental health struggles, and that's why they bonded with this young person. But she noted in her review that, man, sometimes they engaged in some negative behaviors together, some negative coping things, and overall it was positive. But in this case, we're talking about doing this through a program, through a nonprofit or an institution of some kind, and that raises all kinds of legal things as well with that. So we got to find a balance between using this experience and these, the knowledge these people bring well, but also, how does that fit within the context of a program that's got rules and liabilities and other
That's
issues.
right.
So
that's right. Yeah. Well said. Well said.
I think that kind of tees up the last question I wanted to ask you about this, David, because I think, this is an emerging idea. I mean, obviously people have been doing credible messenger mentoring for a long time, but I think with policymakers and philanthropy and those of us who do work trying to grow the mentoring movement, there's some real interest in kind of expanding this idea. And so I'm curious to hear, when you looked at the broad research on this, what would you tell, say, a policymaker about like, hey, if you want to invest in this kind of mentoring, here's a few things you should keep in mind. And then lastly, what would you tell maybe program folks? You said earlier at the beginning of this interview, not everyone's going to do this purposefully specific work around lived experience, but are there things that any mentoring program could think about around lived experience in their mentors? So we'll start on the policy side first and then go to the program side.
That's great. And the policy side, I would advocate from my perspective, having delved into this literature, and then more generally just having seen more than one area of prevention and program program variety come to the scene, if you will. And it's a lot of excitement, which is great. Easy does it, one step at a time. And I think really taking care to not try to go to scale too quickly. I know that may be tough for some people to hear, but I would encourage really trying to understand more about. There's not going to be one model for sure, but to understand more about what are some of the really key points around training and support, and empirically do those kind of relationships that take root and get deep, and there's a lot of sharing of that. Are they in fact correlated with whatever the desired outcomes are for that program, like less recidivism? We don't know that at this point. So we're kind of intuiting that it looks like that should really be important, but we don't know, right? And so I'm not suggesting that everything just kind of has to kind of be stuck in first gear and not progressing toward larger scale and so forth. But I really think even before doing a lot more efficacy, or we call efficacy trials, outcome-based trials, where like we think we have a program that's up and going, it looks like it's pretty solid, and we want to see if it has impact. Most of these programs, even with a lot of really great thought and some nice institutional support, they're like in that arches, the percentage that actually got it at that level, wasn't what you would want, right? And you're never going to get to 100%. You may not get to 80%. It's complicated. These people's lives are complicated, but we don't really understand even how to maximize around things like the exposure and engagement and basic programming. I will say one thing I think is really promising, and this is what National Institute of Justice funded. I think in both projects, I believe that it funded around this recently, is a community-based participatory research approach where you engage individuals from the community in ideally all aspects of your research, but certainly in this case in developing a program and potentially, of course, in implementing it, which that's kind of lived experience mentoring, right? So, but also, are you figuring out things like the training and what some of those do's and don'ts are and where the latitude is? How do you recruit people effectively? That's been a pain point of why some of the dosage hasn't gotten up there. And so I think it would be a wise investment, I think, to generate some foundational learnings around optimal program design and seeing what it takes to get those designs implemented before moving into more and ideally incentivize that work. So if you can show you've got it up and going, you engage people not with lived experience in the design of it, and you actually made it happen to a reasonable degree, then now there's another set of funding available to do some outcome-based work around this program. And this is what I'm describing as a model they use in some other fields like education, where they just you don't go in and get funding right off the bat. You need to kind of do the R&D work iteratively, so that's the policy side of it. The program side of it, I think, and I have not really unpacked this fully in my own thinking and not read much about it, but on the surface, just from some relatively light consideration, I feel like in mentor recruitment, are you sending the message out, if you're open to it, that you not only that you welcome people coming to the program with lived experience relevant to the kinds of experiences that young people you're serving may have in their lives. And that isn't always been the case in mentoring. If not explicitly, unfortunately, we tend to stand up examples of folks who often have more formal education and so forth, and that's not going to be the situation with a lot of folks who are trying to get involved in a lived experience mentoring program. And I think they're already feeling stigmatized in many cases, and you have to work hard, not just be neutral or silent about it, but really, it seems to me that you could, if you're open to those folks, and then maybe everybody benefits, your staff benefits, because they're hearing from that mentor about some of that lived experience. Other mentors may be hearing about it. So you're kind of stocking the pond of your program with lived experience in ways that even without a lot of deliberate planning, you may benefit from. And certainly thinking about within, and I'll wrap here on the thought, but when you get into the actual programming, when you're thinking about matching, are you thinking about lived experience background matching? Probably yes. How systematically? Yes, in many cases. A lot of times, and it's important, we have reason to believe from research, for those similarity of interest to be there. Like, yes, I really like outdoor kind of physical activities, and somebody else is really interested in arts and music, whatever it might be, or somebody's particularly outgoing, somebody's less so, etc. But also, and that's hard. I've been interviewed as a mentor myself. Did I talk about that I sometimes have struggled with depression? Not really so much, but I have. And that could be a great piece for them to say, when I interviewed Leroy, he really didn't crack a smile the whole time. And his mom says he's really just kind of concerned, in the mental health issues, and he's been in some counseling. I wonder if David, he was upfront with this and having, worked through some of this himself would be a good fit. I don't think a lot of that is going on. And I think, again, there's some programmatic things you really have to commit to make it a safe space for mentors to come, even reveal what some of those lived experiences are. They don't all have to be stigmatizing, but a lot of them will be, I'm afraid. And so you're kind of you could do a lot more intentional matching if you got more of that information there. And of course, taking family preferences in. It's like, no, I'm afraid of some of those negative coping things they're going to learn. I don't want somebody, versus like, oh, that would be great. So again, it's I'll stop. Those are
Yeah,
thoughts.
no, that all makes complete sense. And I think the more you know your mentors as a practitioner, the easier it is to pick the right person to match with a particular child. But I know that in cases, I mean, obviously programs are looking into your criminal background piece, right? That's important for safety reasons, but this comes up in the disability mentoring work. It's like, oh, do we even ask? A lot of programs are afraid to ask about disability status because they don't want to be perceived as discriminating against protected class. But I also think I've heard practitioners say we don't have any people with disabilities as mentors in our program. Like, I'm sure you do. You just don't know that you do. Dyslexia doesn't grow on your face or something, right? I mean, so like,
Exactly.
so
Good point.
if you don't ask, then you won't know. And in the case, your personal history you shared, like, yeah, that probably didn't come up in your interview, but it might be the right thing for that right kid at the right time. And so I'm also glad you mentioned the recruitment piece, because I think there's, and I don't know whether this is an insurance industry issue or a board of directors at the nonprofit level issue, but being comfortable with having mentors in your program that look a little bit different than this idealized, kind of ridiculously, high standard mentor that we all have in our mind, right? Of super person. And it's like, no one is super person, right? Even the most successful of us have our dark sides and personal foibles. But when you're talking about like, yeah, I'm bringing in a batch of mentors that have all done time in prison for fairly serious things, a lot of people get very skittish around that, even though, if those people have turned their lives around and are healthy. I'm glad you mentioned the fact that this is an opportunity for them to give back and for society to, get
Lift them up
out of their experience and to make something good happen out of something that may have been negative in the past. And so I hope we continue to find ways of involving all adults in mentoring experiences, because unless you're a real piece of work, you probably have something valuable to give a kid. It's just going to look different than what some other mentor might be providing a young person. So well, thank you, David. I know the review will be coming out soon. We're not quite sure exactly when this will be available for download on the NMRC site, but I appreciate you giving our audience a sneak preview. I think we'll have it up, probably early 2024, if not before then. But I know folks will be really excited to see what's in it. So, David, thank you for a really great conversation here, but I do have one final question for you. This year on the podcast, I asked all of our guests the bonus question, and I'll give you the same question I asked everyone else. Hypothetical scenario, you have invited 4 famous people from history to your house for dinner. I don't really care who the 4 people are, though. You can tell me if you want, but my question is, what are you serving these 4 famous people for dinner, and what music do you have playing in the background while you eat?
Wow, that is a great question. I think that I would have, on both counts, a lot of variety. I think the kind of people I would have would be open to that, and also might, though, differ in some of their preferences. And of course, I'd be mindful of dietary strict requirements. I was gently chided. My daughter's attending a Jewish school, and we were ordering pizza for her Halloween party, and one said, well, don't want pepperoni. That wouldn't be exactly, I don't know. Oh, yeah, good point. Yeah. So yes, I would be mindful of those kinds of things, but otherwise, really kind of maybe even ask each of the persons to kind of suggest something, if they're willing to go that way, even thematic, for what represents it, as is in the Jewish tradition, when you have Seder, right? Every piece of food, the salt of our tears, as we made Exodus from Egypt and so forth. So I think that could be kind of fun to then take their orders, if you will, and have them explain. And I guess I'd go with the food, the music too, and have them. We have a family friend who is just, he loves this. Every year it gets people together for the top 10 party, but everybody comes with their top 10 songs, but they talk about why those songs are important, right? And we know music is so inspirational in many levels. So I'd probably let them kind of set the stage and just be the implementer.
Yeah, well, that's great. Now, we tried one of those, everyone add 10 songs to a Spotify playlist for a family drive over to Central Oregon a few summers ago, and we didn't make it through the playlist because it led to a series of arguments that led to us never attempting that again. But I'm glad to hear that you would not be serving Gandhi like a Chicago dog with like mustard and peppers on it. He's probably a vegetarian. Exactly. So, but good answer. Everyone had good answers this year to that question. Yours, though, I think was the most, kind of meeting your guests where you're at. But so next year on this podcast, I should let our listeners know that we will have more bonus questions, but they will be asked of our guests by the new hosts of this podcast. We are going to be mixing things up a little bit on Reflections on Research, and next year these interviews will be led by young people. We've got a youth advisory group on the National Mentoring Resource Center project, and we've decided to let those young people talk to researchers, and we'll see how much they regret it about 3 interviews in, but we thought it would be nice to give some young people a chance to talk with researchers and ask questions and learn more about the work of our research board members over the course of next year. So while I have enjoyed talking to you, David, and all of our guests, it'll be a while before we hear this voice on this podcast. But David, thank you very much for a great conversation today. We'll be sure to let everyone know when that research review is out, but certainly I think there'll be more to come on the credible messenger topic through this project in the year ahead. So I encourage folks to keep checking out the NMRC website and look for more stuff around credible messenger mentoring. So thanks again, David. Enjoy the day, everyone, and we'll see you next time on Reflections on Research. Thank you.